Okay, hi everyone. Like she just mentioned, I'm the product manager at Even. Christian unfortunately could not make it today, but he sends his warm regards to all the friends in the room. There we are. Now, I've been at Even for about 1.5 years now, doing product management, partner coordination, so on and so forth. When we were on the topic of nationalities, I'm actually from Sweden, so if you have any IKEA jokes, please hold them back because I've heard every single one. Now, Even develops Just.io, which is what we call a business intelligence platform for mobile apps. So we do user acquisition, performance tracking, analysis, and so on and so forth. And we've been around since about May, April last year. And we have just a couple of metrics of what we're doing in a given month. This is from September. And we're working with some rather large corporate brands. We're working with a lot of IT companies, working with a lot of startups, so you get a sense of where we're getting our data from and what experiences we have. And so in my job as product manager, I spend a lot of time analyzing individual campaigns. I consult new clients on how to make their app setups, how to figure out what metrics to measure, and that's a few of the perspectives that I would like to talk about today. And so I have really 3 quick points that I would like to just go through. On the one hand, what are the metrics to measure in your app? And how do you make sure that these metrics are actually meaningful to you? On the second part, when you have found meaningful KPIs, how do you understand the definition? And how do you make sure that you can compare them over time and compare them to your other parts? And finally, we would like to talk about something that we've been working on very hard in the last couple of months, which is cohort analysis. And it's been mentioned a couple of times today, and I would like to go through a little bit exactly what that means and what you can do. And so to start with, what metrics to measure? And we've hit this topic a little bit, and I think that especially Stephanie was touching on this. This has to come from you, because it's very, very different in different verticals. And Lele, I'm sorry, I used dating and not social discovery, which seems to be a nicer word, but we'll live with that. And generally speaking, each different kinds of apps, these are a couple of examples of verticals we work with a lot, and the kind of behavior that you're attempting to inspire, the kind of behavior that you're trying to track and you're trying to create, and which will lead to success, are quite different depending on what you're doing. For example, in a publishing app, like we work with Frankfurter Allgemeine or Süddeutsche, basically what you want users to do, you're charging them indirectly for their engagement. And so what you're attempting to do is you're attempting to make them open the app, click on an article, or click on a page, and stare at it for a really long time. Whereas with a social discovery app, for example, if you were to see the same behavior, that would pretty much be mostly creepy. Similarly, with e-commerce apps, you're trying to push people to browse around a little bit, take a look at different products, and that's a wholly different behavior as well. So of course your metrics will vary a little bit. You might be looking at engagement metrics slightly differently, and the custom events that you'll be tracking are of course very different as well. There's also the aspect of the app lifecycle, which I'm sure a lot of you have a fairly decent sense of. Apps do have a more or less distinct lifecycle, and you have very different metrics through this. This is an example that we made with a gaming app in mind. A lot of my team is from a gaming background or otherwise have done app development, and this is sort of a freemium sort of model. And of course this is a longer span, but you see that they're in the acquisition phase. Of course you're looking at retention, you're looking at whether you're getting the right kind of users. In a monetization phase, you want to kind of ask yourself, well, who are my paying users then, and where are they coming from, and how do I get more of those? And so that's also a different aspect to keep in mind. And so you go through this process, and we consult our people to look at the business models. Where are you getting your money from? What sort of behavior should your users demonstrate? And then you get there and they say, well, I have about 300 different KPIs that I would like to look at. And we always tell them, well, that's a really bad idea. And it's a really bad idea, and we've also touched on this, a few previous speakers, that if you're trying to do what you do with a solution like Just.io, you're trying to optimize campaigns, or you're trying to optimize different features. And you need to know whether a recent campaign has actually improved your results or not. And now if you're looking at, let's say, 15 different registration metrics, the problem is that you won't really have an easy answer to that question. You'll look at it and you'll go, well, it's good in some ways, and it's really shit in some ways. And you have this kind of mental algorithm where you're trying to figure out, okay, well, what's the most important thing here? And you might wind up making a decision that you kind of like, but isn't necessarily the best for your app. And so we really recommend to keep it down, find 2 or 3 metrics that are meaningful, that really capture the behavior that you're looking at. And then when you get a campaign and you see, okay, well, they are actually behaving exactly like I need them to behave, and there you go. And so I'm not actually going to push too much on the what metrics to measure because it's a really general question and it really has to come from you, and that's kind of what I'm trying to push here. So I would like to work a little bit more and demonstrate some of the things that we've done with how we define KPIs and how we look at KPIs, because that's ultimately what our business is. And so one major question is, when you're looking at KPI, is what does it mean in comparison to what I've done before? I had a similar campaign a year ago, and now I'm seeing completely different metrics. What does that mean? Or I have an iOS app and an Android app, and I'm looking at the same metric. Why are they different? And this is what we say when we say comparable KPIs. We have attempted to build a solution, or we're working a lot with our clients, to really figure out how these KPIs come together. And as a little bit of a lesson learned, I'd like to take an example. And we worked initially with the session metric. And session metrics, I'm sure you're all very familiar with. It's very important. It's a sort of basic engagement metric. And a lot of subsequent metrics that you'll be looking at for your chain will be based on, let's say, the number of sessions or the number of revenues per session or blah. And the problem is that initially the easiest definition of this is saying, okay, well, a session is when my app is in the foreground. And that makes a lot of sense. That seems reasonable. It's easy to program. It's easy to understand if you're explaining it to somebody. And this also made sense, you know, when OSS were still pretty primitive and still pretty new. But what you're seeing immediately is that we're starting to get to a point where your app is not necessarily in the foreground, but somebody's still using it. So for example, if I open your app and I then pull down the notification center, you're suddenly out of foreground. And if I pull up Spotify and change the track and then go back to your app, I've also moved you out of the foreground. Or if you ask me for push notifications, you've also moved me out of the foreground. And the sort of easy tracking 101 sort of solution to this problem would definitely be to just say, okay, well, the number of context switches is the number of sessions. And we had a bit of problem with this because, you know, you'll have one app that has a push notification request and another that doesn't. One app will have twice as many sessions as the other, even though there's no actual difference in user behavior. And this is one of those things that we started working on. So we went back to the drawing board and we figured that there's a very excellent web definition, and we actually stole this pretty much from web. And that is that a session is let's say, a continuous stream or a burst of activity from an app, which is separated by a 30-minute break from any other such stream. And we went through and we looked at these numbers, and the thing about that is that when you start thinking in this way instead, you'll find that 30 minutes is pretty much always 30 minutes. The only exception is if you're on a spaceship. So it's the same on iOS, it's the same on Android, it's the same in different apps, and it's the same in different campaigns. And suddenly you have a metric that you know exactly what it means, and you know exactly how many they are. And when we started rolling this out, we built a feature in our SDK to understand this difference natively and not even talk to our server unless there had been a new session. And we started rolling this out, and we said to people, okay, well, last week you had 600 sessions per user in the first couple of days, and this week you have 5. That might sound very bad, but it's actually a much more tangible number. We start thinking about it, and well, actually, five sessions, that makes sense. I can look at that and I can think, you know what, someone downloaded it and used it 5 times. It's pretty easy to see. And that's the sort of thing that I think it's important to have an understanding of the kind of metrics that you're looking at and have an understanding of how they're defined and how you can compare them across each other. And I'm sure that, you know, any feasible, any real tracking solution here, and we heard before that you shouldn't pick the others, and this is unfortunately for this reason. A lot of these more tricky kind of KPIs, these tricky definitions, are really hard to do if you're not in the tracking game as your main focus. And now, so with that over with, I would also like to talk a little bit about cohort analysis. And we've heard a lot about this today, and I think that's great because it's a really important aspect. And cohort analysis is something that we have been working on really hard in the last couple of weeks with some selected partners, and we've been doing it internally just to figure out exactly how it's going to work. And in its strictest definition, what you do is you group users together on a common criteria. So before we saw a cohort based on the people who had browsed, we saw cohorts based on the people that had just read something or that just downloaded, and we saw cohorts based on generation. In a marketing context, you'll often be looking at cohorts based on the time of install. And so you lump people together who downloaded or installed at a certain point in time. And that's pretty much the fundament. How I like to describe it, if I can get the next slide, there we go. How I like to describe it is, let's say that you're making wine. And I know absolutely nothing about making wine, so my example is going to be a little bit lackluster. But let's say you're making wine and you change some part of your process. And so you take out your new bottle and your old bottle and you taste the two. And you think, well, holy shit, I am really incompetent. My new bottle of wine is in no way better than my old bottles. And of course, we all realize that most bottles of wine get slightly better as they age. They sort of mature. They have a certain defined lifespan. The wine goes from being bottled to becoming a little bit different over time. This is really the same with users. They download your app, they don't really know how it works, and they work through it, and they start maybe buying something in the first week, and then they kind of move on. And as long as you're retaining them, you start kind of understanding how things work out. Of course, with Lavoo, for example, you might very well, in the first week just look at the radar, and then eventually you start discovering more of the features, you start sending more messages, you start getting more messages, so on and so forth. And so that's what you do with cohort analysis. You take a glass from the wine bottle as if it was there on the day it was bottled. And so, for example, let's say we're looking at revenue by week, and we take out the first cohort. And the first cohort, let's say, is everyone who installed your app on week 31. And then you look at their exact behavior over the next, let's say, 6 weeks of their life cycle. And you start thinking, okay, well, that makes sense. I have 1 week of users. They're all in the same level of the time span. And then in order to compare that to another group, you'll take out another cohort with the same method, and you'll pull out the numbers for somebody who installed in week 41. And you pull out their first 6 weeks. And they'll have the same flavor, so to speak. They'll have the same stage in their lifespan. And so we can compare them with a much more sort of, well, it's more comparable, let's say. And you're erasing the interference that is their lifespan in itself. And that's kind of the eagle eyes view to cohort analysis. We have a couple of case studies, but I think it's a little bit too short today to go through them. So we're actually publishing a couple of case studies next week, possibly, and then you might be able to take a look at that. Like I said, today was short, so I'm going to summarize it there and say that what I'm seeing when I'm helping people set up campaigns, and what I'm seeing when I'm troubleshooting campaigns, and when I'm talking to partners, is that there are really 3 things they need to consider. First of all, make sure that your metrics are meaningful in that they mirror what you want your users to do, whether you want them to send messages, or whether you want them to read articles. And you need to really look at that. On the second point, you need to make sure that you understand what this metric does. And you need to make sure that it makes the same sort of sense the first time you use it as the next time you use it. And you need to make sure that it works over all your different apps, whether you're using Android, BlackBerry, who uses BlackBerry, I guess, iOS, and so on and so forth. And finally, we really want to push cohort analysis because we're seeing immense effects here. And you've also heard it today, and I think that makes a lot of sense. Because that's really the way that you can really compare your users without having any interference from the lifespan. And yeah, if there are any questions, feel free to drop me a line. We'll be publishing some more publications on this topic later on as well, and I can give you some hints further. I have to say the Haas Offers blog is also great. They do some great work there over there too, so I'd like to recommend that as well. That's it for me.